Start again. We're recording this webinar, so I'd like to welcome everybody to Nexlearn's Immersive Learning University's monthly webinar series. I'm Lance Miner. Joining me today is Sarah Crow. We're instructional designers with Nexlearn, and we're going to be presenting on knowledge engineering, getting the most from your information. Let me do a real quick test. I'm going to pass my admin notes real quick, but I'd like to do a test. You should have the option to raise your hand. If you show you got your hand raised, show me you got your hand raised. I know I've got you. You're hearing me well. Thank you, Fatima and Amy. I appreciate it. Yeah, all the hands are going up. That's great to see. Well, welcome everybody, and I'm going to go ahead and pass a couple administrative notes. We've got we're doing our ILU webinar series on a monthly basis now, and we already have next month scheduled. It's scheduled for June 27th. And Ken Spiros from Nexlearn, he's going to be presenting on using Sims in the classroom. So book your calendar, and it'll be about the same time, 1 o'clock Central Standard Time. And we look forward to everybody participating. We also have some other participants lined up, but we'll be posting that schedule a little bit later. I'd also like to remind everyone that on January 29th and 30th, next year, we're going to be having our Immersive Learning University conference in Charleston, South Carolina. It's a 2-day conference, the 29th and 30th, but on the 27th and 28th, the 2 days prior, we're going to be having some workshops, one on our authoring tool, SimWriter, and the other, we're going to have a guest presenter come in and speak on the theories of instructional design. So we really hope everybody will get a chance to come participate. Charleston's a beautiful city. I lived there personally many years ago, and it's a great place to visit. So those are the 2 admin notes. If you've got, we've got several of our Nexlearn staff here available to answer questions, so please feel free to post some questions. We're going to be asking questions and posting some polls to help get participation in our seminar today. And we would like to make sure that any questions you post, we'll try to get to them. If we don't answer them immediately, then we'll try to get to them at the end, definitely. If they're good questions, we'll pause our presentation and bring them forward and open things up for discussion. Right now, we're probably going to keep everybody's mics muted just because it causes, if somebody's got a hot mic, it can cause reverb and things like that. So if you've got a question, post it, and depending on what's going on, we may hand the mic over to you, or might just keep it via text, and we'll communicate that way. But what I'd like to do now is introduce Sarah Crow. She's my partner in crime today, and she's going to be doing the majority of the presenting, and I'll be acting as color commentator on occasion. But Sarah, you'd like to take over?
Thanks, Lance. So as Lance said, what we're going to talk today about is knowledge engineering. And basically, knowledge engineering is what happens right after you get the budget and get cleared, and before you actually start writing the simulation or training course. Knowledge engineering is a term that we use here at Nexlearn to define the process of gathering information from relevant sources prior to building the training course. This would include things like building objectives, finding and utilizing subject matter experts or SMEs, finding resources and supporting material, or establishing basic information and context. These are all examples. There are other things that you can use, other things that can take place during knowledge engineering depending on what else your needs are before you start building. We're going to start off with a quick poll question asking you folks what information you usually know before you start building a course. Number 1, who will take the course. Number 2, how the course will be delivered. Number 3, the experience level of your students. Or number 4, some combination of 1 through 3. So we'll give you a couple of seconds to respond to that. And then once we hear back from most of you, we'll close the poll and I'll give you some results and we'll move on.
And this may differ depending on what industry you're in. So. A couple more seconds. I'm going to give you about 10 more seconds.
Yeah, this is gonna depend based on your needs and such. This is just kind of a question to throw out to you folks. So there's no right answer or wrong answer at this point.
All right. And let me share with you the results.
It looks like the vast majority of you, as I expected, had a response of number 4, some combination of 1 through 3. And that's a very common answer. So I'll select that. As you prepare to start building your course, you want to find out who will be taking the course, where the course will be taken, how it will be delivered, basic information like that, because it's easier to organize information and speak to your students properly if you have all the context established early on. So the sooner you can establish the basic information of the course, the better.
And a lot of times this might be directed to you. You'll be told, hey, you have to develop this certain kind of course. If you're in the aviation field, there's a lot of times there's hard skills that have to be taught, and we can use simulations to teach hard skills. So you're not going to have as much latitude. But a good creative instructional designer can really bring new angles to things if you just put some thought into it. Bring in different experts to help us. One thing we here at Nexlearn do is help people act as a sounding board for ideas for other people, other designers.
So when you first begin to start with the knowledge engineering process, you're going to start with 3 steps: establishing the basic data, finding your SMEs, your subject matter experts, and then processing all the data you receive to synthesize into your course. This is an example of some basic data questions. Kind of went over a couple of these before. Real-world conditions of your experience. Other examples might be how many people are taking the course, what sort of platform. Is it going to be a combination of in-person training? All good examples of establishing some of the basic data of the course. And then this is the context and impact of the course, a little more specific and honed in. What is the context of the program? What effect will it have on the individual and on the company if usually you're only training a certain group of people within the company as opposed to a full company unless you're doing like HR training. And then you'll want to look at the structure specifically. One of the good points in here is the second point. Think about, should the simulation be cooperative, competitive, or a test of understanding?
You were working on a course for sales course for one of our clients that had some pretty good ideas about competitive.
Yeah, one really good time to use a competitive course is especially dealing with salespeople, for example. Salespeople are naturally competitive. They want to do better and improve. And so turning it into a competition among salespeople, a friendly competition, of course, to get the best score on the simulation can help them to perform better and will encourage them to retake the simulation repeatedly to ingrain those practices. More course structure questions, just for your reference. Quizzes on the third point are very common. You can do a pre-quiz, post-quizzes, depending on how you want to establish understanding. You can do a pre-quiz that would figure out where the student is coming from to begin with, and then a post-quiz to figure out what they had learned from the simulation. All options you can use.
That last point you have there, talking about the proper path, I think that's an interesting point to make, is that so often training is developed in a very linear fashion. The PowerPoint slide where you're clicking through slide after slide, and it's a very linear presentation. That's the beauty of simulation, is it allows you to create deviations in the plot line, if you will, and allow options for failure, which I think we're going to talk about a little bit later. But the idea that you have a path that your students are going to follow, that's good. And that, as good instructional designers, we can take them down what would appear to be a wrong path to allow them to learn from failure. So
it's very important to learn from failure. We'll get into that a little bit later too. Okay, we're going to go back to another poll question. I'm going to allow the course to take a number of directions. We'll get to all 3 of these points at one point in the course. I just want to let you guys decide which way you want to go. The question is, what do you want to know? Number 1, how do I get useful information from my SMEs? Number 2, what other information do I need to build my course? Or number 3, how do I create learning objectives? So I'll give you a couple seconds to respond to that, and then we will figure out which direction we want to take.
You got it. Yep, we got a couple more seconds here. Last voting, and we're going to go to close it. And let me share the results here.
Overwhelmingly, people wanting to learn how to get useful information from their SMEs. So let's start there. Okay, the first thing you want to do is, of course, find your SMEs, which may or may not be easy depending on where you are at and who you're dealing with. So you want to ask yourself 3 primary questions. Who knows the material best? Who has the most experience in the subject matter? And who is involved in the process or processes you want to teach?
Who knows the information best and who's actually doing the practical application can be, oftentimes aren't the same people. One person who may be a classroom instructor or a known author in a subject area may be available, but having someone who is just down and has learned from on-the-job training or has been doing it for 20 years on the floor, it might be just as knowledgeable or more knowledgeable. So take that into consideration.
You also, depending on what you're doing and what process you're teaching, you also don't necessarily need to limit it to people within the organization, depending on, of course, non-disclosure and all of those requirements. But you can also think about people outside the organization who might be good resources or research sources for you. The first thing you do want to do, if you can, is get your SMEs together and meet with them. Because if you get people together, you can benefit from the pool of information and the brainstorming that can come from meeting with a number of people. So if you do have the opportunity to meet with SMEs, I highly encourage it as a group. When you do meet with them, you need to make your first job listening. Do this by asking short and open-ended questions and leaving gaps in the conversation beyond social comfort. That's very important. If you feel social pressure to move forward without basically keep things moving at a clip, you're going to lose information that you could receive, because a lot of times that extra space allows your SME to reflect and think about what they may know. So even though it feels awkward and it's hard to do at first, let them take a couple extra beats of time and think and reflect on what might be, what more information might be valuable.
And maybe you might, in order to avoid the real awkwardness around a conference table, if you're sitting across a desk from somebody, is have your notepad there and just kind of keep taking notes, and a simple head nod will keep them talking at some point.
You do want to focus your dialogue on stories before process, because the story is where you're going to get a compelling training experience. We've been telling stories as human beings since cavemen sat around fires, and stories are how people relate to each other and to the world. And so if you can put any part of your training into a story format, you're going to make a more relatable and compelling training for your students.
You can remember movies you've seen from 10 years ago, but you might not remember a class you sat through, and the reason you remember it is because of the stories.
Yep.
So if you build training around stories.
Yep. That's one reason why we are so focused on simulation and simulated experience here, is because it is so valuable for retention and understanding and memorable experience for your students. You also want to consider the number and position of SMEs that you have in one meeting. And actually, our next poll question, which I'm going to pop up in just a second, does relate specifically to the number of SMEs that you have in a meeting. What results can come from consulting a group of subject matter experts? Number one, you can maximize the useful information you receive. Number two, information may be stifled, especially if there are power disparities involved, like a supervisor and subordinates. Number three, you may receive conflicting information. Or number four, all of the above. I'll give you a couple seconds to answer that one. Ready?
Quick.
Okay.
All right. And let me show you the results. I think it's pretty obvious. We weren't fooling you on that one.
No, no one fell for that one. It is all of the above. Oops. Hold on. Sorry. You do want to be mindful of issues that can arise with too many people present. It's great to get brainstorming material, but sometimes when you get too many people in a room, or as Lance says, too many cooks in a kitchen, you can get conflicting ideas about how things should be done.
Ideally, you can kind of alleviate this problem by establishing some good lines of communication with the major stakeholder that you're working with on the project. So if there's someone who's going to be the decision maker, or if you're starting a project, you want to identify that decision maker early on in the process and then communicate with him or her that this is a common problem that you may have in a group SME setting, and you need to make sure that that they help communicate expectations, and they clear the air and allow communicate to all the experts in the room that, hey, we want your input. But on the other hand, if there's conflicting guidance, that one person in the room to make the major decisions, he or she's there, and they will be the final choice on it. So it's a balancing act, but if you're good, take some time, practice good communication skills, you can work through it.
Yeah, and one thing to keep in mind is the people that are in the meeting are all valuable, or else they wouldn't be in the meeting. So when you get a large group together, you want to be conscious of the people who aren't talking, and maybe focus a specific question at them, especially if you know what their role is. For example, if they're a 20-year salesperson, although usually the salespeople don't have a hard time speaking up, but if they're just sitting there and kind of not saying anything, to encourage them to speak by asking them a direct question can elicit some very good information.
A lot of times if they're bringing in the people you need to watch for are those the accountants that may be in the room. Sometimes those are a little bit more introverted people, or the numbers crunchers. So it's keep that in mind, and just be sure you welcome them into the conversation.
Mm-hmm. One example of having too many cooks in the kitchen, we had a very large company that we worked with just a few months ago that we did a knowledge engineering with, and they had probably 30 people on that call, and they were all putting in information and talking over one another. And so you're going to want to definitely be certain that you have a decisive person on the end, so you're not 3/4 of the way through the project when someone pops up that, oh, this is completely wrong and we need to rewrite it. Yeah. That's nightmare time. So yeah, definitely try to have 1 or 2 people who are decision makers, and balance the information from all of your SMEs as much as you can. Discussion topics that you can have with your SMEs would be best and worst case scenarios, consequences of failing to meet objectives. One of the big ones is why it is important that the potential students have the skills you want to teach. This is a very important one because it helps you to understand the motivation and possibly even pull a story out that you may not have found before. You also want to make sure when you're meeting with your SMEs to discuss any other sources they may have, because you may or may not have knowledge of them, especially if you're not an expert in the area yourself. So any sources that they will reference will be very valuable for you as well.
And confirm that those sources are up to date too. For example, if you're dealing with OSHA, OSHA's made a recent change, and we need to that affects many different industries. So understanding that you're using the right and most accurate resources is very important.
It's vital, yeah. Other meeting platforms and tools, these are kind of self-evident, but I wanted to make sure we had them listed. If you can't get all of your SMEs in one place, these are all very viable options. One that I wanted to point out especially is social media. There are a lot of companies who have internal social media platforms, either an internal forum, or even I've seen companies that have actually have fully executed social media like Facebook or MySpace type of platforms that they actually use within the company. So if you have them, use them, because they can be very useful to at least quasi-replicate that brainstorming time in an actual meeting.
And if it's something that can be recorded, like a chat session, or you got forums or bulletin boards of some sort, then you can go back and pull those for posterity's sake. You got the historical data.
Yep, which is always good. When you meet with SMEs, the most important things to remember, first of all, most information from the discussion you have with your SMEs will not be used in the course.
And that seems counterintuitive.
It seems counterintuitive, but you want to get as much information as you can so that you can structure the course and then pull from that information the best and the most useful and work backwards from there. Like I said before, keep focused on story over process and look for opportunities to help the student fail forward. One of the beauties of things like simulations and role-playing is that the student is in a situation where they can fail without consequence. They get to experience what it means to fail, but they don't actually have to pay the consequences, like, you know, losing their job or falling out of the sky if they're doing a pilot simulation. So those are definite opportunities to look for. Those moments of failure are very useful learning experiences.
Bringing in immediate correction is also the benefit you get from that failing forward. They fail, but then you can immediately show them how and why they failed.
Yep. You also want to try to remain in contact with your SMEs throughout the process if possible. I can't tell you how many times I've started writing a simulation and gotten halfway through and realized I need some really stupid piece of information, like, you know, what do you use as a promotional tool, because I want to throw that little detail into the sim as kind of a wink and nod to the salespeople, like, do you have any squeaky toys or anything that you give out as promotional materials? You know, stuff that you don't think of before you start that will become important as you write to help make the sim more alive and more rich for your student or any training experience. Okay, we're back to the question. What do you want to know next? Number 2, what other information should I have to build my course? Or number 3, how do I create learning objectives?
This is where you get to direct the training, and this is a new format for the webinar that we're using, and we try to make it so that we zero in on what you want to know, and it gives us feedback and allows us to improve our presentation as well as hone the details that we provide. So, all right.
Okay. Do we have something?
So we do.
Oh, wow. Look at that. Number 2, what other information do I need to build my course? Great question. Okay, let's go there. And this actually follows with another question. And this is, again, not just a poll question. It's not a wrong or right answer. It's just an opinion on your end. When you build a course, what materials are most important to use as a reference? Number 1, manuals, user guides, etc. Number 2, industry recommendations. Number 3, forums, polls, and other data. Or number 4, they're all equally important.
And your industry will determine this a lot. If you were in a very mandated, compliance-driven organization, you may have different things that are going to be the source for your training.
Yeah, if you're doing, especially if you're doing HR training in particular, manuals, user guides, laws can be very important. So.
Well, thank you. We got give you the answer here.
We actually had a little bit of a split. I mean, it's 60 to 30, but for most of you, they're all equally important. And the answer is actually kind of a trick question, because it is up to you and the needs of your training, which That's kind of what we said while we were waiting for answers. Keep in mind the demands of the content, the needs of everyone involved in training. Don't forget about the needs of your trainers if you're doing in-person training, because they may have need for resources that your students don't necessarily need to have access to. Materials and necessary references after training are also important. If they don't necessarily need it for training, but it'll be useful afterwards, definitely keep those tools in mind as well.
With multimedia options that we have today, you can develop your training with the understanding that it's going to be used as a just-in-time source. So you could not only create the course using SimWriter and then publish it, but then your students can then go back to that training and refresh themselves, their memories, and actually pull up source data that they need for on-the-job work.
Yep, I've seen, we're actually going to be doing one that's going to use specific videos, how-to videos, that the student will then have access to after the simulation ends as well. There'll be just-in-time videos that the student can pull up on their mobile phone and look at after the course is complete. So definitely don't discount the usefulness of just-in-time tools that can be used after, both during and after the simulation or whatever course is complete. So you want to think about the materials necessary to complete the simulation. Forms or other paperwork, books, websites, programs, and applications, as in like iPhone apps or something like that. Any sort of tools that can be used to aid the students. You also want to think about how the student will access this information outside of the simulation if you're building a sim. You want to consider documents that are referenced for the program and references for students. And like I said before, talk to the SMEs if you're not 100% sure in particular.
Keep in mind, too, if you're going to be testing the students within your training simulation or within your training program, that material needs to be readily available, and that has to be the source document, because if you test them and then they answer a question and they can go back and find a correct answer somewhere else that it doesn't comply with what you presented, then that can cause a disparity and actually cast a shadow of doubt on the validity of your training. But you may have supplemental information that you want to give them that is helpful depending on if they want to use it, and it might not be testable material. And you can have that in an extra resources place, repository.
Yeah. A button in case of a simulation. We use resources buttons all the time. And like I just said, you can attach them directly to the simulation. You do want to be sure to put them in PDF format, which seems self-evident, but might not be. There's not only are PDFs almost universally able to be opened, but that keeps them from being able to be altered. So that's very useful. And then also, it's not really a relevant document per se, but when you finish the simulation or the training, if you can give them a report to keep them conscious of how they performed on the objectives that were asked for, that can be very, very helpful for your students. Okay, and we don't need to do a poll for the last one, since we'll just go on, and I'll do this very briefly because it was definitely the point of least interest for you folks. But we're going to ask a question about Bloom's taxonomy, first of all, for those of you who know what that is. Basically, the below verbs represent the highest level. Which of them represents the highest level of learning development? 1, explain. 2, construct. 3, compare. Or 4, apply. And this question basically asks which of these verbs reflects the highest level of understanding for your student.
No cheating. Get off Google. I'm watching you.
He's not.
All right. Okay.
Okay.
I'm going to give you a couple more seconds. Counting down. All right, and we're closing.
Again, we'll show the results.
Apply wins it. With a couple people getting construct in there. What is it, Sarah?
Well, we're going to answer apply, since that was the most popular. The actual answer is construct. Now, this is because applying information is actually a step lower than construct, because apply allows you to apply it to a relevant situation. But if you take a step further and you construct a new program or a new product based on what you've learned, you're actually synthesizing it in a different way. You're taking that information and you're creating something new instead of simply applying it to a relevant situation. So construct is actually the highest level.
It requires an additional level of creativity, making something out of nothing using the ideas and concepts that you've been taught.
Yep. Other examples of verbs at this level are manage, build, create, and propose. You can usually see objectives develop as you're meeting with your SMEs initially. So you want to think about the measurable results you would like to see from students. Objectives are the most useful if you can come up with a measurable type of result.
You're going to ask, if one of your learning objectives is to understand, how do you measure whether they understand it or not? You need to be more specific with how you're going to measure those objectives. We'll look a little bit closer there.
Use active and specific verbs to build learning objectives, and focus on only one goal for per learning objectives. When we build simulations, we usually focus, for the average half-hour, 45-minute simulation, look at 3 or 4 objectives. You don't want to overload a training program, because if you're doing too many in a simulation or in a training experience, people can become overloaded and actually process less than if you're just speaking to a few very concise objectives. If you have a lot that you want to achieve, consider maybe doing a number of shorter training experiences instead of one very long one.
Micro-learning objects?
Yes, because the shorter learning is actually, cognitively speaking, yes, it's better retained than a longer experience. And I figured I'd throw in Bloom, since we were talking about him earlier. Bloom's taxonomy was developed in the 50s to help people categorize the type of output for a learning objective.
Interesting fact that there were several different educators building this taxonomy. Bloom just happened to be the highest on the alphabet.
Yeah, he just got the credit.
Yeah.
So there was a committee that was involved in this, I believe. But anyway, the lower levels, remembering and understanding, are actually achievable through active or passive learning, whereas the higher levels of applying through creating are achievable through active learning only. However, were you about to?
No, go ahead.
Okay. However, you can actually combine the lower levels in a passive learning experience to result in a higher level result. So you can create 3 or 4 objectives that use the remembering and understanding and actually result in a higher synthesis and result of, being able to manage or create something as a result of the training.
Before you jump ahead, everybody just take a moment and look at these words, the verbs that we have, and ask yourself, and this is just kind of a rhetorical question here, but ask yourself, how would you evaluate someone who is critiquing? How would you evaluate someone who is designing something? There has to be something measurable, and we as designers, instructional designers and teachers, have to understand that to truly, one, you can teach somebody something, but then to go back and evaluate them requires a very specific action that has to be measurable, and you have to be able to assign some sort of score or a definitive yes or no quality to that level of evaluation. Thank you. But keep that in mind as you're developing your learning objectives.
One example that comes immediately to mind is under the creating, you have manage at the very top. And we have so many simulations that we have created over the years about management and, for example, how to manage a difficult employee. Well, we, of course, have essentially quasi-passive learning. I mean, it's engaged, but it's not actually going out and doing it per se. We combine objectives in the remembering and understanding to help someone understand how to properly manage a person in this type of a situation.
They might identify certain behavior, identifying behavior.
Describe how to speak to this person or how to address their issues, that sort of thing.
And then a good way to, if you're going to further evaluate it, is or put them in a scenario. How do you judge managing? You may put them actually in a scenario or a case study that can actually force them to deal with a variety of complex issues beyond just giving them a list of tips and pointers and dealing with difficult employees.
Yeah. So. An example of where a simulation really can create those higher level learning objective verbs out of an experience. Okay, and we are almost done, so let's give you an opportunity to ask us what you would like to know. If you want to post questions in the question box, we will take a look at those and address a couple of them.
I have a question here, Sarah.
Okay.
This says, how can you do knowledge engineering if you don't have a SME? I think that's a good question.
The short answer to that, it really depends on the material, of course, but the short answer would be you're going to end up doing research. Depending on, for example, if you're doing an HR, you're going to have to go back to HR laws. You can also consult people outside of the company. This is when it's a really good opportunity to find experts outside of the company that would be willing to give you advice and give you information.
You have to go out and find, I mean, you may not have SMEs or experts within your company at all, so you have to go out and find them. You have to go outside, and sometimes you may be limited by the fact that these people might actually want a fee for their services, and you might be put in a position where, well, the company's not going to pay any money for that, so then you fall back on the fact that you as instructional designers or a trainee manager have to become the experts, and that's one reason why I think I read in Newsweek that instructional designers are some of the more creative people out there. So yep. Pat yourself on the back.
Yeah, the other thing to think about is actually using other instructional designers in particular, because there are a bunch of forums online and in social media for instructional designers who can talk about, addressing basic questions like that or not so basic.
We've got another question.
Perfect.
This is from Kelly Izquierdo, and she asks, how can you limit your SME, the information they provide? How can you be politically correct when you limit the SME if they provide you too much information? So you don't want in our scenario, I think we've experienced that a couple times, where you have their clients and they're paying for our services, and they really are the experts in their area, and they start giving us information, and they, I think, have a satellite company that came forward.
Oh my gosh!
At one point.
Yeah, we were working for a satellite company, and they were fantastic people, but we got a glut of information. And it's just going to come to the point, like we said, where you are going to not use the vast majority of the information that you're going to be given. So you're going to want to look at that, prioritize what you have been given, and decide, what is the most important information here?
You can fall back on really fundamentals of learning, and that's where we as instructional designers, you have to have a strong foundation in the theories behind instructional design and education, so that you can turn to this expert who has a PhD, and actually he is a rocket scientist, and he's highly intellectual and a savant in many areas, and then turn to him and explain to him that though he is fully capable of understanding these highly complex, intricate theories, his employees may need to take it a little slower, and then you can recommend building, instead of just a course, you put together a program of instruction, and it's a series of modular courses that then build on those things, and with the understanding, you tactfully present it to them in such a way that we can get them there. It's just going to take a little bit more time, and you got to take smaller steps, and with the impression and the understanding that it is in the best interest of the learners. And so you focus the intention and back on your learners.
Yep. Yep. If you, the whole goal is to focus and be the advocate for your students, because they are definitely the most important part.
Got another question.
Good.
All right, these are great. This is from Sherry. I hope I don't mispronounce her name, but Sherry Duca. And she says, how do you get a SME to understand the information from a development perspective that you're asking for? It's very frustrating. You're right, Sherry. It can be very frustrating. Go ahead, Sarah. Want to tackle it?
Let me see. How do you understand from a development perspective? Okay. So this is where it can be very useful to focus back onto a story. Ask them for specific examples. Ask them for a very specific story of the time something went right, a time something went wrong.
People like to talk about themselves, so if you can redirect it and have them, ask the question in such a way that, well, tell me a point, tell me a time when you did, for example, going back to the aviation, tell me about a time when you had a specific problem with a manufacturer and the quality of the parts, and they can usually come up with a scenario. That gets them talking about the story again, and then it's our job is to kind of, if we can keep them at bay a little bit and keep them from from hounding you about what it's going to be, so that you can then take those stories and translate them into a presentable, palatable, approachable lesson or a course, and then ideally they will see it. And you may not get it right the first time. You present it to them, they come back. That's why it's important that you have beta testing and client reviews, or in the case if you're working strictly for your company, you have your stakeholders or your bosses or managers review the material. So yes, I got a reply, excellent story over process. Thank you. I'm glad we answered your question, Jerry. We appreciate you participating. So we have another question. How do you keep the SMEs engaged throughout the design phase? And this is from Julie Nelson.
Julie, I think the best way to do that is to keep them in the loop a little bit. I know when we have outside people, we have project managers on both sides of the table, both with the client and with ourselves, and we have weekly updates that go out to the project manager and says, this is where we're at, this is what we're doing. Depending on how you build your simulation or what have you, sometimes you can show them maybe a preview, or testing can also keep them engaged. If they know that they're going to be a part of the testing, they can anticipate that happening, and you just keep them engaged by keeping them up to date on what's going on.
The calendar is a great tool. Set clear deadlines for yourself as well as for those SMEs, and let them know that, hey, I'm going to have you, tell them well in advance, I'm going to have something for you to review on this day, I'm going to need it back a couple days later. Make the timeline tight for them so that they're forced to engage with it, because if you give them too much flexibility, then they can procrastinate and put things to the back burner, and you don't want them to do that. Another thing that I've found is helpful is, and this depends on the SMEs you're working with, but they're already identified as an expert. So that is one thing that appeals to their ego. I hate to use the word manipulation, but that's kind of what you do. Is you remind them that they are experts and that you need them, and that they are participating in something that will build and help enhance the legacy of what they contribute to their industry. And it's true, you're not lying to them. You're really appealing to the fact that they are important in this process, and your training is important. If it wasn't important, they wouldn't be providing you with the task to develop it. So I hope that helps. What do we have here? Deanna Neal, she asks, how do you measure learning objectives that use the verbs such as construct or design? That's a good question, Deanna, and that's kind of what I was hoping I would get a follow-on question like this, because this is one of those things where learning objectives, there's an art to writing learning objectives, and those more complex ones like construct or design, the way I approach them is you break it down into smaller, more what I would call enabling learning objectives. So you may have a greater terminal or overarching learning objective that is to construct or design a program, and that's what you have. Let's take the example of we're developing courses for project management, and we need the project manager to be able to construct a full-length project management project from start to finish, and that may require them to evaluate timelines and it may require them to evaluate their resources, the people that they have to work with. And so there's steps in evaluation, and then you can create smaller chunks of instructional content that allows them to do that. For example, in this scenario, they have to evaluate the resources they have. So you can then provide them with a dossier of employees that are part of the team, and they need to evaluate, which is lower down on the Bloom's taxonomy, evaluate the quality or the skills, not the quality, but the skills of their resources, and then apply those people to certain tasks. So you break it down into smaller chunks is what I would recommend.
The other thing you can do with the design, or what is it? Constructor design, the other thing that you can do is actually encourage them to create a product that they then present to you outside of the simulation. So they take the simulation and then create the product, create the project plan out of basically a fake, maybe if we're going on the project plan, a fake staff. And then they can present that to you after the training. We are actually working on something where we will do the same thing and encourage people to bring back their creative work from a project that we're working on, encourage them to send that to us, so then we can figure out if our students have actually processed and learned what we are trying to teach them. We do that in training,
yeah,
too.
It's also important that you create a checklist or some sort of criteria. If you're creating a project plan, there are certain fundamental aspects to a project plan that you would then compare, and does it have an appropriate timeline? Are the timelines appropriate for the task? Does it make effective use of the resources? Does it adhere to the budget constraints? So those are all things that are measurable. They're smaller chunks that can then be used to evaluate the overall success of whether they constructed or designed the project. So hope that answers your question. All right. Well, we got a couple more minutes. Any other questions? Here's another question that came in. This is, what are the measurable ways to evaluate upper level objectives? And this actually falls right in with kind of what we talked about with the creating and design. I think we answered that.
We actually answered that one.
Yep.
Okay.
Would you present that? Okay, this is a follow-on question from Deanna. Would you present that checklist to the learner as they develop the quote homework?
Yeah, absolutely. It depends on whether you want to evaluate whether they can do it on their own or not. If you want to give them the checklist and then let them figure it out from the checklist, or if you want to figure out how many of the checklist they can intuit from the training, it depends on whether you're evaluating or you're teaching.
I think you would. One way I would do that is if you've got this. I just got this quick question from Todd Went here. He said, I joined late. Will the recording of this be sent to us later? A recording will be available, Todd. So thanks for asking. But back to Deanna's question. I think if you have the time, you build a module around that checklist, and you explain to them what are those fundamental elements of a successful whatever. If we're talking about a project plan, is what we've been talking about. What are the successful elements? And you build lessons around identifying the successful elements of that project. And then, in the end, once they get to the construct and design phase, then you actually force them into the higher realms of Bloom's taxonomy by making them evaluate their own work or evaluate a peer's work, so that they're then not only demonstrating that they learned the initial information about the components of the checklist, but then they are applying that checklist to what they've done or what their peers do. Good?
Good. Yeah, I think we've answered most of the questions. Let's just move on. To summarize, I'm just going to do a quick rundown. You want to establish the basic data, find and interview SMEs, assemble your resources, process the information you've received, and build objectives that will help you write your course.
And then adhere to the objectives. A lot of times you'll start writing, and you may get off on a tangent, go in some different direction. But those learning objectives are designed and identified, and ideally get those learning objectives approved by your stakeholders or by your managers or by those SMEs before you start writing.
Mm-hmm. We always do an objective and storyline to our stakeholders first. So your ultimate goal in training should be that it would be engaging, informative, and accessible. So keep that in mind as you build and as you start to create your simulations.
All right. Well, I think that's it. Once
Yep.
again, I'd like to remind everybody next month the follow-on webinar for June is going to be on June 27th, and it's going to be presented by our own Ken Spiro. He's going to be presenting on using Sims in the classroom. It's going to be highly interactive like this. We'll be using the poll and question format. We're also going to be, I just want to remind everybody, those of you who showed up late, the Immersive Learning University, the ILU conference, is going in Charleston, South Carolina on 29 and 30 January. And 2 days prior to that, on the 27th and 28th, we're going to have 2 workshops, one on the authoring tool, SimWriter authoring tool, as well as a workshop on theories of instructional design. We really appreciate everybody's participation, and we look forward, as told Todd, that we will be presenting or posting this recorded webinar to our website, so you'll be able to go and check it out later and pass it around to your friends.
Yep.
And we will also be sending out a follow-on email. If you have any other questions or comments, we do welcome constructive criticism. What is the info@nexlearn.com?
Yes.
Yeah. So you can send any comments or recommendations to info@nexlearn.com, and we really do welcome the feedback. So to Sherry, thank you for your, she says it was excellent and valuable information. Love the poll questions. Thank you, Sherry. We appreciate that. And to Tony Watkins, AJ and Tony Watkins were going back and forth, and he says thanks to AJ, who's one of our Nexlearn employees here too. And we really understand, we really appreciate everybody's participation.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Have a
Sarah.
great day.